Welcome to There's Sometimes a Buggy, Irresponsible Opinions about Classic Film. I'm Elise.
I'm Dave, and this week it's the final episode of our Paul Robeson Acteurist Oeuvre-view. We'll be discussing Tales of Manhattan and a pair of documentaries, Native Land and Song of the Rivers. After that, stay tuned for our Robeson rankings, and we'll also have a short letter from a listener.
So Dave, Native Land was actually released slightly before Tales of Manhattan, but I assume that we do want to group the documentaries together and talk about them separately. They are interrelated in some ways.
I agree with that method of proceeding. And we'll start with Leonard Maltin. He won't be with us for the documentaries. They don't appear in his 1991 TV movies and video guide. He gives Tales of Manhattan 3 stars out of a possible 4. Charming film about the effect a dress tailcoat has on various owners. 5 episodes, alternately amusing, poignant, ironic. Our favorite, Down and Out, Edward G. Robinson attending 25th class reunion. Pictorially stylish throughout, photographed by Joseph Walker. The director, Julien Duvivier, and our cast list, Charles Boyer, Rita Hayworth, Henry Fonda, Ginger Rogers, Charles Laughton, Edward G. Robinson, Ethel Waters, Paul Robeson, Eddie, Rochester Anderson, Thomas Mitchell, Cesar Romero, and George Sanders. This is the 118-minute version. We actually watched a more complete version which features 1 extra story with W.C. Fields, Phil Silvers, Margaret Dumont, and a host of other interesting oddities.
You'd seen this movie before.
Yeah, I had it on VHS tape.
And your memory of it made me dread watching the Robeson sequence. Well, your memory of it plus the fact that he hated it so much that he gave up making movies after this, or appearing in movies anyway. What were your feelings about it after seeing it again?
I think they're more complicated than they had been in the past. I just remembered it feeling like it was a strange story shoehorned into...
No, it's not at all, is it?
No, it does fit more elegantly into the overall design of the film than I recalled. It is dealing in stereotypes.
But consciously and cleverly and subversively.
I think that's right. I think there's more to it. It'll be a less depressing discussion than I was worried it might be.
In fact, I really enjoyed all of the movies for this week's episode.
Yeah, this was not a bad way to go out. Now, we don't see much of Robeson in any of these movies.
That's true, but his spirit presides over all of them, even Tales of Manhattan to a certain degree. As I said, I quite like Tales of Manhattan. We'd also seen Duvivier's anthology film Flesh and Fantasy, and we were so-so on that, as I recall.
Oh, I like that one. We talked about it on a Halloween episode a few years ago.
Yeah, I think you liked it. I was lukewarm on it.
Ominous Omnibi. I like that title for the episode, anyway.
And I'm not a fan of anthology films in general. Dead of Night is quite a good one, and I thought this was quite a good one. Although some of the episodes were stronger than others, but that's part of the design. It's a film that a lot of leftists, to one degree or another, worked on. Duvivier had made Popular Front movies in France before coming to Hollywood. Van Heck worked on this. Alan Campbell, Dorothy Parker's husband. Donald Ogden Stewart, who was an actual commie. Do you know anything about Boris Moros?
No.
One of the producers was a member of the Communist Party and was in fact a Soviet spy, but then later became a spy for the FBI against the Soviets. So he became an FBI double agent. And I think that it all comes through. The left angle, it does come through in the movie as a whole. We start with Boyer and Hayworth and Thomas Mitchell story, which is the wealthiest and maybe the silliest of all of them. And then we have something similar but in a lighter tone with Ginger Rogers, Henry Fonda, and Cesar Romero.
Gail Patrick, let's not forget her.
Then we have Rags to Riches story with Charles Laughton, which was one of my favorite sequences. An extraordinary performance by Charles Laughton, don't you think?
Oh, it's really good, yeah.
Great use of Laughton, with good support from Elsa Lanchester. Then we get a Riches to Rags story with the also great Edward G. Robinson. Robeson. Then, after a strange little episode, well, a couple of strange episodes, one is W.C. Fields, which was, like, neither of us are Fields fans, and, you know, that is like a category of comedy lover or cinephile. This was very funny.
Well, he's an amazing Mr. Macabre. And yeah, he's pretty funny in this sequence.
Then a strange episode takes us outside of Tales of Manhattan altogether into the highly stylized world of Southern black sharecroppers.
And the link there is a heist.
Right.
J. Carrol Naish.
I read a very good article on this sequence in Tales of Manhattan by Charles Musser, a Yale film historian, who co-edited a book on Oscar Michaud that I now really want to read. And just mentioning Michaud in passing, the way he talked about him, actually makes me want to do, well, I guess I was already leaning this way after we watched Body and Soul, but really does make me want to do Michaud's silent films for a future episode. He also, it turns out, is the fellow who wrote the article on Aslanda's time in Africa and Robeson's relationship to Africa and that South African documentary that he was a narrator for that we decided to leave out kind of arbitrarily. Did the other two documentaries, and one of them, Robeson's relationship with, is very glancing.
Unfortunately, yes.
We were misled on that one. We at least thought he was going to narrate it. So that was Song of the Rivers. I'm not sure if there's any version where he narrates it or if Wikipedia was just smoking crack.
That's what happens when you podcast without a net.
It was still worth seeing, and it does have an interesting relationship with the other documentary that Robeson does narrate. So this article, we should link to it. Paul Robeson and the End of His Quote-Unquote Movie Career by Charles Musser. This article is the kind of scholarship that needs to be done on Robeson's film work. And he's calling for more of it in the article, but I'm so sad it doesn't seem that he has written much more about Robeson's film work. This article came out of his co-curation of a retrospective of Robeson's film career at the Museum of Modern Art. He says that there was some resistance to this, and I'll quote, "From one quarter we were told that certain films were so embarrassing they should not be shown to the general public. These individuals, including Paul Robeson Jr. and members of an outreach board at the museum, expressed concern that we were out to destroy or undermine Robeson's public integrity. Of course, this was not our intention. We were and are interested in understanding this career, and it is my experience as a historian that forbidden or neglected areas are always among the most important to such a project." And then he talks about how, in that light, this essay is a re-examination of Tales of Manhattan. Now, in this terrific essay, he talks about how the episode is probably engaging with, and he has a whole theoretical framework for how to discuss what now seem to us, and to some even at the time, very unfortunate representations of minorities, right? And he's a film historian, so he's looking at it from a historical perspective. So he thinks that this episode almost certainly was in dialogue with Cabin in the Sky, which had not been made into a movie yet, and its transition to film was delayed by the war, so that Tales of Manhattan ended up coming out before the movie, and therefore the intertextuality it was seeking was lost on most moviegoers. Tales of Manhattan was a box office hit, however, and so he gets into what these stereotypes were, why the black press often tolerated them anyway, because at least great stars and black people in the arts in general were being employed in enterprises like this. The Tales of Manhattan sequence is at once engaging with these stereotypes and undermining them in ways that I thought were quite obvious and sophisticated when I watched the sequence. Like I said, we should link to this, and I think it's worth reading for anyone who was interested in our Robeson series. Intertextuality and how important that is. And he also talks about how he arrived at an understanding, and listeners to this podcast heard us do the same thing in real time, with less research, with less evidence to back it up, how he came to the understanding of how sophisticated a work of filmmaking, Body and Soul, is because of its relationship to stereotypical representations of black people in popular media made at the time by white people. And so he thinks that something similar is going on here. Of course, in this case, it's white people undermining the stereotypes. And of course, Ethel Waters is transported straight out of her stage success with Cabin in the Sky and was also going to appear in the film version.
Right.
So with those tools in place, do you think think what I brought up is relevant to how you understood the sequence. I should also say that Clarence Muse, brilliant man, I'd like to do a special subject on him. We brought him up in the podcast before, and he has a very brief appearance in this sequence, but he defended the sequence on the grounds that he thought it could bring attention to the plight of black sharecroppers, and he'd appeared in an 11-minute short film about this subject called The Broken Earth in 1936.
The same year he appeared in Showboat as Helen Morgan's best friend at the club.
And what it says on Wikipedia about that film says, shot on a farm in the South with non-professional actors except for Muse, the film's early scenes focus in a highly realistic manner on the physical labor of plowing scenes with black farmers. Although, overall, it is the story of a black sharecropper whose son miraculously recovers from fever through the father's fervent prayer.
Oh, I'd love to do a series on Clarence Muse if we can find enough movies that he has a sizable role in.
I think we'd have enough for maybe one episode with 3 or 4 movies.
And some shorts.
Yeah.
If we can find those shorts.
We should try to investigate. The sequence, it looks extraordinary. It's expressionistic. There are other elements in the film that are expressionistic for sure.
The whole movie looks amazing. It's shot by Joseph Walker, Capra's preferred cinematographer.
But this is the most expressionistic sequence, the most stylized, the most Brechtian. The expressionism extends not only to the, blasted heath of the field set, right, but also to the camera work, which is almost Wellesian. The way it's darting around and the strange angles that it's filming the preacher and the children from in that broken down church, right?
And the church looks like it has been through several bombing raids.
Oh yeah, and actually that's something that Musser brings up in his article, how he thinks that Duvivier is actually evoking not only, the hellscape of the poverty of the sharecroppers, but also, obviously the condition of black people in America in general, but also the war-torn European landscape.
It's like a Nazi blitzkrieg has been loosed on this town, and in some ways it probably has. It was a clan blitzkrieg. So we meet Robeson and Ethel Waters hard at work trying to get something out of the soil. This tailcoat drops from heaven out of a plane.
It's smoking.
It's smoking, and it's filled with wads of cash extracted from a society soiree by heisters. Robeson immediately wants to put this money to work and modernize their operation with a tractor, Soviet style.
But originally he's just thinking about how many tractors he can get for himself.
Okay, sure. Well, that's a natural first step. But once you start realizing that there's enough to buy a fleet of tractors, it starts to get even more interesting and more communal in nature.
Now, Ethel Waters, I haven't seen Cabin in the Sky, but I think she's playing a role quite similar to the role she played in that movie.
Yeah, I think so. It's been a long time since I've seen Cabin in the Sky.
Well, that was my impression from reading the article. So she is playing a stereotype of a black woman who is...
the matriarch.
Well, she's a matriarch, but she's also, and we saw this obviously in Body and Soul, very spiritual, interested in Christianity and following these moral rules.
Well, she's the moral arbiter of the community, far above the preacher.
Well, yeah, in this case, rather than her being enthralled to this preacher, she is representing the political potential of the black church, whereas the preacher is not.
He's just really been ground down by years of hardship and failure to break through the political constraints upon the community, I imagine.
Well, that's how you see it? And not as he's actually...
Well, he's not malicious.
Yeah, so you see him as being quite different from the hoodwinking preacher of Body and Soul.
Yeah, he's not going to disappear with the money, I don't think, although I guess he could.
Musser thinks he's thinking about it, albeit briefly.
Yeah, I'm sure he does give it a thought. He's got a little bit of the con artist in him for sure, but it's Eddie Anderson, and ultimately he does seem kind of benign.
The issue is that the black church can be a force of political liberation, or it can be a force of conservatism, accepting your lot.
Right.
As we talked about in the Body and Soul episode, the white imagination of black spirituality is, aren't these all delightful with their wonderful natural attunement to spiritual life?
Pretty demeaning stereotype.
So we can see Body and Soul itself as an intervention in that idea, and another kind of intervention in that is going on here, because the church is not going to provide the solution. Even toward the end, when Eddie Anderson's character has come around, when the preacher has come around and he's going to go along with distributing the money to everybody according to their need, or according to their prayer. He still has this grasping, greedy impulse to aggrandize himself and his own power, right? He still shouts out, and we're going to have a church, and we're going to have a real church, everybody. And then someone calls out, how about a hospital? So this movie is deeply skeptical about religion as the solution to the problems Black people are facing in America.
Right, but it's also quite sanguine about the availability of concepts like solidarity and community strength that are also accessible through
Ethel Waters' spirituality.
Yeah, and through her interpretation of Christianity.
Eddie Anderson's performance in this movie is my favorite, other than Charles Laughton's.
He's pretty funny. I mean, he always is.
But just the rhythms of it.
Nicodemus?
The rhythms of his comic delivery, together with the rhythms of the editing, it's just brilliant. He's almost like he's playing the Jack Benny character. The way his shifty cynicism is cutting through this stylized portrayal of naive spirituality that is taking this inexorable turn toward a socialism that he's really not ready for. I just love it.
What, we're going to have 40 tractors working all the land? We're going to buy all of the land around here? That's crazy. Again, I guess it is continuously playing with that double-edged sword, right? This idea that people are going to rally together based on this evolving interpretation of the social gospel and Christian values turned in that direction. But there is always this danger that someone happened to wish for something crazy that's going to mean that all the money has to go to them. And the final stage of that is that, well, maybe the most downtrodden of us all, this man that lives off by himself, he doesn't even have the bare minimum things that we've been subsisting on. Well, maybe he actually prayed up this money and we're going to have to let him have it.
Right, and it's Ethel Waters who, as you're saying, like her spiritual energy could go either way. It could blow in the wind like that scarecrow's jacket. It can be turned towards socialism or it could be turned towards...
Yeah, it would wind up being something very wasteful. And we've already got one person, Clarence Muse's character, whose prayer was for a relatively expensive coffin. Well, what if this guy wanted the most ornate sarcophagus ever created?
Doesn't that scene where they're giving out the money, does that not remind you of the
It's a Wonderful Life?
The bank run. I wonder if Capra was inspired by this.
You never know. And obviously Joseph Walker was working on this. I'm sure he saw the movie because they were collaborators.
This is the most stylized sequence and the one that is using folktale characters. So you get this perfect folktale structure of the ending. We see everything, despite the shifty blocking attempts of Eddie Anderson, we see everything going in this positive direction that we, if we are progressive and sympathetic to these economic ideas, that we want to see it go in. And then at the last minute, same woman who got this all started, is she going to screw this up, right? So we're very tense.
Fortunately, it turns out what this man had prayed for was something to make a scarecrow with. So the money is just completely fortuitous byproduct of that wish, and it can be used to fund this game-changing purchase of the land.
When Robeson's character says, a new day is coming, or whatever he exactly says, he's talking about 1942. He's talking about, let's deal with these fucking fascists in Europe, and after that, let's create a brand new world.
It feels inspirational. Didn't quite go as well as people were hoping in 1942, but the chance was there, and this movie is definitely gesturing toward that.
Do you want to do a little bit of irresponsible... Musser does. So do you also want to do a little bit of irresponsible speculation about why Robeson hated this movie so much, when we can see the ways in which it is subverting the stereotypes that it's using, and he himself would have been aware of that, and presumably that is why he agreed to do it, although he may have thought he could have had more influence over it than he did. He was offended by the stereotypes, and the fact that Hollywood couldn't move beyond them.
Pretty reasonable.
Yeah, of course. I mean, on the one hand, we have to look at what he had been doing in England, the kind of films he'd been making, so he hadn't had to play this type of stereotypically naive folk character.
No, the closest he'd come is in Showboat, and...
Exactly, and he didn't like that either.
No, but that character gets to sing one of the best songs of the 20th century, even though he has a very complicated relationship with that song.
But think of this movie and that movie as bookends of Robeson's Hollywood cinema career. right? And it's the same kind of idea. He is playing this stereotype within the very limited purview of what Hollywood would allow black actors to do, because otherwise, as he knew, as he said about this movie, otherwise it's not going to play in the South. They're afraid of that, right? So I can't play the kind of roles I was able to play in the films that I made in England, but both of these movies are doing their utmost to subvert those stereotypes, but clearly Robeson was sick of having to do things that way.
I can't say I blame him. We, as viewers and historians, can really dig into these and think about the various ironies that they're working with. But if you are actually condemned to live in that society and be constrained by those ludicrous racialized conventions, it would depress you, I'm sure. And he probably felt like he could get more out of life purely as a singer and as a political activist.
Well, what he went on to do right after this was star in Othello on the stage. Lusser says before Tales of Manhattan had entered the theaters, Robeson had begun his Othello project with Jose Ferrer and Uta Hagen.
Okay, well, that's a better use of your time, definitely, right?
And what else was a better use of his time is that he then became involved with these avant-garde socialist documentary filmmakers, and he hoped to do much more with them than he even was able to do. They talked at various points about, the native land director, Leo Hurwitz, wanted to make a fiction film with him of Freedom Road.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
Once we see the extraordinarily politically engaged and cinematically sophisticated independent filmmaking that he immediately became involved with, that he was already involved with at this time, you can see why Hollywood's version of sophistication was not enough for him anymore. This is what he wanted. Like the Soviet documentary filmmakers, like all Marxist filmmakers, he did believe that cinema was the most important weapon they had.
Yeah, it was the most popular art of the century, could reach everyone, and can really deliver some indelible messages and images.
So is there anything more you wanted to say about Tales of Manhattan before we move on?
No, I think we should keep it Robeson-centric. I mean, of course there was a lot of interesting stuff going on in the other segments, but it doesn't seem like the place to talk about those here. So maybe we'll watch it again from a different angle one day.
I did enjoy it a lot.
Yeah, me too.
So, Native Land, directed by Leo Hurwitz and Paul Strand. As one could gather simply by watching the movie, but otherwise I wasn't familiar with his name. Paul Strand was an American modernist photographer and filmmaker, who Wikipedia says, along with the likes of Alfred Stieglitz and Edward Weston, helped establish photography as an art form in the 20th century. So Leo Hurwitz made many a leftist documentary inspired by the Soviet filmmakers, by the likes of Esther Shub and Zyga Vertov, Eisenstein, Podovkin, and Dovzhenko. I've heard of some of those names before, most of them in fact, but not all of them. And watching these films actually for the first time, because we are not at all knowledgeable about documentary filmmaking, but watching these films actually made me for the first time want to look into the Soviet filmmakers who were Hurwitz's and Joris Ivens' inspiration. I guess I can't do better than quote a little bit from this article I found on JSTOR from the introduction called Native Land, an interview with Leo Hurwitz by Michael Klein and Jill Klein in Cineast magazine from 1974.
Year I was born.
An important year also for that reason. So what do they have to say here? Leo Hurwitz is possibly the only American independent radical filmmaker to have produced a sustained body of work over the last 4 decades, although he has received inadequate recognition. Coming from a socialist background and influenced by the avant-garde culture of the 1920s, Hurwitz set out during the Depression years to make films that fused political commitment and aesthetic concern in the documentary and narrative modes of presentation. In the 1930s, Hurwitz was in contact with a group of writers, actors, and artists that included Paul Strand, Paul Robeson, Woody Guthrie, whose music we also hear in Native Land, Hans Eisler, Joris Ivens, the primary director of our other documentary, and Mark Blitzstein.
He did the music for Native Land.
In the early part of the decade, Hurwitz obtained his first film experience by working with other members of the Film and Photo League in the production of newsreels and short documentaries on the labor movement and political events of the time. This experience later led to the formation of the Frontier Films Collective and his co-direction with Paul Strand of Native Land, America's first feature-length labor film with Paul Robeson as narrator. They also talk about how in the 1940s he got involved in the development of television news broadcasting, and he did want to make two major feature film projects, Woody Guthrie's autobiography, Bound for Glory, and Howard Fast's novel, Freedom Road, to star Paul Robeson, but did not get the funding for it. Yet another magnificent Robeson unrealized project.
Film marquee.
Before I say anything else about Hurwitz, although I heartily recommend this interview, it was absolutely fascinating.
It's available online.
If you have access to JSTOR, through your public library or your university library, it is. Again, it's from Cineast, Volume 6, Number 3, 1974. This was kind of a revelation to me. Although obviously I know the Soviet documentary example was out there. The fusion of politics with the avant-garde aesthetic in filmmaking. The way that Hurwitz and Ivens both speak about, and probably Ivens was an influence on Hurwitz here, speak about documentary filmmaking as a form of poetry and the union of content, significant content and form. They basically just threw out the stupid Soviet realism aesthetic that was also adopted by the party in the United States. They just threw it out because this is fucking stupid. And we're like, no. We're going to think about form and content at the same time. We're going to think about how the form can raise consciousness, can raise political understanding, and we're going to think about what you can do with documentary cinema as an art form. These things must necessarily coexist, not just that you don't have to make a distinction between them.
Yeah, there's a very hypnotic, incantatory aspect to both of these films, and that's certainly deliberate. Just a textbook perfect Popular Front 1942 film from a socialist perspective. It is embedding all of its critique and all of its optimism in American history.
Actually, this is why I heartily recommend this interview, because Hurwitz, I have never seen anyone talk so clearly about Marxist ideas and about the Popular Front version of those ideas as he does. Like, very complicated theory that he just makes absolutely clear and self-evident in this interview. He talks about that and what he was trying to do there, and he also talks about the criticisms by 1974 he was receiving for it, that of course popped into my mind watching the opening sequence, which was both the environment and the indigenous peoples of America are thrown under the wheels of freedom.
Well, they're not present at all in the narrative.
The environment is present to be conquered.
Right. Well, just to be cleared.
Cleared and polluted, and indigenous people are just completely thrown under the bus.
There's no mention.
No.
It's just people coming across and settling a new land.
And what does he say about that? Well, on the environmental front, he just says, yes, obviously that is an idiom that we were using at the time, and you need to, people who are making these criticisms need to understand the metaphor. It's not being literal. I should actually just quote him, because that's a lot better than my attempts to summarize what he was saying. There is a widespread contemporary response which reacts to the superficial symbol rather than to the underlying meaning. In the film, you see a train giving off clouds of steam, or a smoking factory chimney, or a time clock being punched. The response is, oh my god. The symbol is atrocious per se, not taking into account what these images meant in an era of 16 million unemployed, or in an era where industrial workers had to fight their way to organization. It is a response of undifferentiated pity. Every machine, everything that has made possible the advanced production which could eliminate poverty should not have been brought into being. This response fails to understand that ecological destruction has happened because of the exploitation of people and the environment by big business. The machine itself, as an instrument for the transformation of labor and material into what people need, is socially controllable. Those who voiced these responses fail to see the context of the images that worried them. I mean, I had these same thoughts, obviously, as well as my objections watching the beginning of the movie. However, when he's asked about the Indians, he does not have a good response, and, what he avoids saying is, look, we were being pragmatic, and the people we were directing this movie to, we didn't expect them to care.
No, because it is a celebrationist narrative of American history, and it is looking for ways, as the Popular Front did, to meld ideas that come out of the American Revolution and the Bill of Rights with an expanded socialist idea of what the pursuit of happiness really means. and that is given more than adequate voice by Paul Robeson in this film. There are allusions to the Four Freedoms.
Right, which just came up on my Twitter feed thanks to Bernie Sanders and his annual posting of Norman Rockwell's Freedom from Want and discussion about what the Four Freedoms mean on American Thanksgiving.
1942, this is FDR's third administration. His vice president is Henry A. Wallace. This is about as far left as American government had ever gotten. There was going to be, unfortunately, a steep backsliding happening from 1944 onward and down to today. At this very moment, you can see why people like Hurwitz may have thought this is the time. People are vibrating on the wavelength that we want them to. Everyone is now seeing that there is no necessary contradiction between the ideas that the United States was founded upon and social justice for all. They're actually the same thing. Somehow this had been occluded in the past, and the blazing ambition of the Popular Fronters was to keep that at the forefront of people's minds and keep that page of history at the edge of a successful class-based revolution that would use the words of Jefferson and Washington and all these people, Lincoln, to ends that would make sense to their descendants in the 20th century. It was pragmatic, but I think a lot of them also convinced themselves that there wasn't any shocking contradiction.
Well, let's just put this in a way that someone with less historical knowledge, particularly American historical knowledge, such as myself, in a way that this is understandable to me from the way you've talked about it to me, which is what they were trying to do is to show that America has its own socialist history, that this is not a threatening foreign invasion.
The paramount concern, because from even before the Russian Revolution, but certainly after the Russian Revolution, heaven and earth were moved in the political culture of the United States to brand all socialists as aliens and
anti-American,
interlopers upon the American scene.
Even before the Cold War, anti-American.
Oh, of course, yeah. There were attempts to battle that. I mean, Eugene Debs.
He talks about Debs.
Debs did everything he possibly could to make it clear that what he thought he was fighting for was in the American grain. It was difficult. The 40s, right here in the middle of World War II, is where people get as far as they ever did toward convincing at least a decent slice of the American populace and even some people in the government that maybe this was the way forward.
Right, and then of course it all ends when...
Well, the Cold War, when all of a sudden the only significant political enemy the United States has in the world is communist, is the Soviet Union. And immediately, as we see with HUAC and with all of the associated Red Scare circus events of the late 40s and 50s, we're right back to communism as a foreign contagion smuggled across the beautiful, patriotic American borders, and it has no place here.
How are you supposed to use cinema, or media in general, to get the word out that the human rights of ordinary Americans are being violated by capitalism if your own freedom of speech is being suppressed? Do you know what the basis for the content of this movie was, for the main subject matter of it was?
Of course, labor violence goes back to the 19th century in the United States. Of course, it goes back to the dawn of time, but the particular kind of proletarian labor violence that we're talking about in this film, it really gets going after the end of the Civil War with rapid industrialization in the United States. You've got just massive battles going on in the late 19th century between incipient unions and private armies hired by various corporations. Pinkerton agents. Famously, Dashiell Hammett got going as a Pinkerton agent, and this radicalized him into being one of the most outspoken socialists in America because of what he himself and his colleagues in Pinkerton's did to the labor movement.
What do you know about the La Follette Committee's 1938 report?
This is all part of New Deal initiatives to do something to protect the right to organize. The New Deal Promise, the Wagner Prisoner Act is one of the early fruits of legislation under FDR when he had fairly decent control of the Congress as well. The government is pledging to actually step in on the side of workers, at least sometimes. And the language that's being used there is new in American history. And so you could see how people like Hurwitz, they're in a tough place here because they're celebrating that idea that the might of the state is actually going to protect working people for a change. At the same time, we're continuing to see abuses happening even under the supposedly completely new chapter in labor relations.
Well, Dave, that is brought up in the interview as well. Was native land compromised because it doesn't depict the role of the government in capitalism, right? It's not making the government into the enemy. And of course, Hurwitz's response to that is, well, look, we concentrated on a different enemy in this movie. In order to do so, we had to exploit the contradictions within capitalism that makes it possible that sometimes the government will actually be in support of labor.
Yeah. The idea that you even have to use pretexts for firing people is new, right? In the 19th century and early 20th century, anyone who was in the union, you didn't have to frame them for something else or come up with various euphemisms for why they couldn't be hired anymore. You just had them killed immediately or fired them and outright said, well, these guys are organizing and that's not allowed. It's not like it was stopped completely, but there were some countervailing forces that corporations had to pay some kind of attention to, and it may have slowed down their efforts to completely crush unions, and that's about as far as things got under FDR. And I think this movie is clear-eyed about that because it's still showing us terrible things happening. It's not saying that FDR came to power, a few laws were passed, the Lafayette investigations went on, and now nothing is ever going to impede the beautiful union's ability to prosper.
Well, no, and of course it keeps going back to the labor movement itself as the source. Like, the rhythm of the movie is to show these horrible things happening, and then going back to the rising up once again.
Even at this high point of hope, it's depicted as a Sisyphusian task.
Oh yeah, and he talks about that too. The vigilance with which your rights have to be protected, and his view of history as a struggle, right? An ongoing struggle to keep and expand your rights. By the way, do you know who keeps turning up? Speaking of Dashiell Hammett, do you know who keeps turning up as one of the people funding these socialist filmmaking enterprises? Who do you think?
Lillian Hellman?
Oh yeah.
Well, she was never a Pinkerton, but she was quite a pink.
So yeah, Lillian Hellman was just in there dabbling, like Robeson, just showing up everywhere that socialism and the arts could come together and trying to contribute finances.
Yeah, well, she's a pretty interesting person, Lillian Hellman. We should probably do a special subject specifically on her. We will be covering, and we already have covered in some cases, films adapted from her work. We've got an extended prologue, which is just the march of American history from the Revolution to the 20th century, showing some of the backsliding that had occurred at the hands of big business and the people starting to gather their resources once again to basically achieve the second and greater American Revolution, which would be socialism.
So, in the American idiom, socialism as an extension of democracy and the revolutionary past.
Right. The only reason that this might seem like it doesn't work anymore is because we've been drowning in right-wing propaganda about what the United States is since the late 1940s, and it has been unabated. And the Cold War, and these things, they didn't only infect Reaganites and Goldwaterites, they infected the New Left. The idea in the 1960s is that, yes, we are the New Left, we hate America as it is, and we're not going to be shy about telling you, and we have to scrap everything and start over. And you can see why people had that impulse. I'm not judging, because it was an absolutely disgusting time, and it still is. So many abuses have occurred, and they've been committed under the aegis of the American military, the American government, and this flag, and these founding fathers.
Well, Song of the River certainly gets into hatred of America from the international perspective.
While it's understandable, it's a losing game. Politically, in the United States, you don't get any traction with these ideas. If you're trying to develop a mass movement, this is not going to get you there.
Well, yeah, telling the masses hate yourself, it's not going anywhere.
No, it really isn't.
Even if maybe there's a sense in which we should be hating ourselves. There is a sense in which you should be hating yourself. There's also a sense in which you really shouldn't.
That's why all of the work that I did as an academic, as an American historian, was focused on some kind of groping my way towards a popular frontism for the 21st century. That's why I was so interested in abolitionism and transcendentalism as heirs of the Revolution and the Puritan past, and the ways in which those things I felt could easily seem like precursors to socialism. When I taught American radical thought classes, this is how I talked about American history. This is how I talked to American students about how I thought they might want to begin thinking about their country and their political lineage.
Obviously, this is what Bernie Sanders is doing when he's like, hey, everybody, did you know Norman Rockwell, the most American thing that you can possibly imagine? Did you know that he was an FDR socialist?
Jefferson and Washington and Madison, they were not socialists, but the concept didn't even exist at the time. And you can take the Bill of Rights and make it square, at least to some extent, or to a very great extent, with the kinds of ideas that Marx was developing and other socialists. You really can't do a popular frontism that blends American revolutionary ideas with, let's say, Maoism, or with Soviet kind of reified proletarian culture. Because I think what the Soviets really fell into, unfortunately, is this idea that it's, and they didn't really have much choice because they were besieged from all sides and production was all they could think about. But you don't get a lot of emphasis on leisure.
So that's kind of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, I've always, since childhood, hated the idea of work. Anything like the stereotype of the Soviet Union and its worship of work is just anathema to me.
Right, well, that's not socialism, right? That's something on the way to socialism, possibly, but socialism itself, which the Soviet Union never achieved, is supposed to be you work as little as you possibly need to, and your life is yours, and you have everything you need because the community is working together to ensure that every individual can flourish.
Yeah, sure. And of course, Oscar Wilde saw that in The Soul of Man Under Socialism. You see something like that in Song of the Rivers, right? Which is probably the most poetic celebration of work that I have ever seen. It almost makes it seem not repulsive, even though they're showing very repulsive forms of work, but not necessarily, because then it switches, jumping back and forth between the documentaries now, but whatever, because we're talking about broader ideas. But then it switches, because it says, if we were in charge, us people who made this movie, if we were in charge, the world would be happy, and workers would be happy, and work would be a ballet, and work would be a poem, and everybody would have everything that they need, and the human being would be the master of the machine, ending poverty, ending hunger everywhere. And the workers are the ones who would do this. But then it switches over into happy? Anybody in this world is, or the majority of people in this world are happy, and then shows what work can be. But we still haven't gotten away from the introduction, but I will say, Dave, that you need to read this Hurwitz interview, because I think you'd find him very, very sympathetic, and he's just such a lucid and aesthetically aware speaker on these issues.
It does sound like they were confronting him with New Left critiques.
Absolutely, and he'd heard them all already by the time of this, and knew his responses by the time of this interview.
Right. Now, one interesting aspect of the film is that it does give us some narrative sequences, some short film.
Well, we get a couple of enactments of real crimes against workers, which have a lot of pathos to them, and which are filmed in just this stunning modernist style that is so brilliantly, it's kind of like, it's so fascinating that this film, on the one hand, confronts you with an indigenous American socialism, and on the other hand, it is rendered in an indigenous, albeit Soviet influence, but nevertheless an indigenous American modernism in both its cinematography and its music. So talk about Blitzstein for a minute.
Well, I'm certainly no expert on Blitzstein, but I saw The Cradle Will Rock. That's where I got to know him the most. I'm not sure how 100% factual everything in that film is. It's a movie made in the late 1990s. harkening back to this celebrated event from off-Broadway.
Apparently the movie is a little bit exaggerated.
Yeah, I imagine so. Played by, Hank Azaria, I think, in that movie. A gay, modernist, socialist composer who has this labor opera about a workers' uprising. It winds up being taken up by the Mercury Players, but they are prevented from giving the show in any kind of theater, so they have to go outside.
Well, all that did happen. I guess the movie changed a few minor facts for the sake of the drama, right?
Yeah.
But all of that did happen.
It's got a pretty fun performance by John Cusack as Nelson Rockefeller, who finds out to his chagrin what Diego Rivera has decided to paint for a mural.
Yeah, I remember I watched it with you.
It's not a great movie, but it's pretty entertaining.
In any case, so other of his projects were an off-Broadway translation adaptation of the Threepenny Opera, the opera Regina, an adaptation of The Little Foxes,
Oh, cool.
and the Broadway musical Juno, based on Sean O'Casey's play Juno and the Paycock. Obviously, all of the musical theater works in which he was involved reflected his socialist ideas, right? But there is this moment, if we want to emphasize Robeson's role in this, there is this extraordinary moment where Blitzstein's music and Robeson's delivery come together. Now, I've only watched this movie once, so I couldn't even tell you when it happens, but it feels like it's 2/3 of the way through the movie. I don't know in what sequence, but they come together in this way that makes it sound like Robeson is somehow singing a modernist spiritual, and it's just gorgeous.
A very striking film on every aesthetic level.
Except, is it on the level of drama? Because this is silent film level melodrama.
Yeah, but it's pretty affecting. Especially, is it a murder or is it just a savage beating of the farmer?
Well, no, I think he's dead at the end of that. But what about the two men?
That one too. A group of black and white labor organizers in the South meet in this church. They are targeted and hunted down and murdered by deputized thugs. And you have, these very emotional, silent scenes of the two men, the black man and the white man. They don't have names. We don't get to know them, but we see how much they care about each other.
The physicality of their emotions for each other, the physical representation of it. It's like ebony and ivory, except with class solidarity.
It's a lot less corny than that.
Well, the conception is corny, other than the fact that the class solidarity really makes a difference to how we perceive this potential for interracial love.
And I mean, these guys are ultimately killed, so just inevitable pathos there. I don't think you can really undercut that.
You're right. It's in these sequences that are practically silent, like the sequence of the farmer's murder or the completely silent sequence of the murder of these two men, that the movie, I think, is most emotionally effective. But what do you think of the extended dramatization of the spy that's been planted inside of this union?
Yeah, the double spy situation. You've got Howard Da Silva, soon to graduate to big-time Hollywood supporting roles, and then leave as a blacklist victim. You've got Art Smith, wonderful character actor that's turned up in things like Letter from an Unknown Woman that we've seen, and Ride the Pink Horse. So he is actually the deeply embedded spy. He exposes the decoy in order to gain the trust of the higher-ups at the union, and then we see the agonies that he's going through. I mean, I really like Art Smith. Yeah, of course, this is all very heightened, exaggerated stuff.
We see a mustache-twirling villain who has to use strong-arm tactics in order to get him to continue on his course.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure this is exaggerated. This probably is exactly
I don't know, like the little game that he's playing with the cat and the mouse?
Oh, yeah, well, sure, there's some symbolism there. If you don't keep doing every much worse thing that they want you to do, then they tell all your friends what you've done, and then you get beaten up by them. And if you don't do it, you get beaten up by corporate thugs. As soon as you find yourself in this position, you're going to wind up looking very scrunch-faced like Art Smith does throughout this film. I mean, he looks like he's on the verge of a nervous breakdown from beginning to end, and I don't doubt that anyone in his position would be.
I mean, the movie is extraordinarily didactic.
Yeah, of course.
And as part of that, it is trying to use the simplest dramatic building blocks possible in order to illustrate these complex ideas.
This is how we wind up working at cross purposes with each other.
Yeah, sure. And we're all aware of that now, particularly how the FBI intervened in the civil rights movement, systematically demolished the Black Panthers' AIM, the American Indian movement.
I found those scenes pretty effective. I love Howard De Silva's performance. He is just scenery chewing. He revels in being a labor spy. He can't wait to go to the next town and fuck up some more unions. Mostly you're left with Art Smith and you're feeling like, well, this is, the more normal thing. This is someone whose instincts are correct, but they've been perverted and thwarted by power of the masters.
Right, and in the end, he does choose to be a traitor rather than a martyr.
Yeah.
And we see that he has no family and he's living in what appears to be a shabby one-room apartment.
Yeah, and the only people to take care of him are the people he's betraying as they brew up some coffee for him.
I feel like the union, should have done a little better by him so that he was living in better circumstances here. But how are they going to do that when they keep getting fucked? So you might ask yourself, considering how much thought was put into how to make an artful and beautiful film that would nevertheless also serve as a way of educating workers.
Did anyone see it?
Did anyone see it? Because this is totally independent filmmaking. And these are the people who were doing independent filmmaking even before Cassavetes, even before Ida Lupino, the socialists. That's who was doing it. They had big ideas about how they were going to talk to trade union people to try to get the word out and just create enough demand that the local theaters would be forced to show the film. This is how they were going to get through the monopolies, right? The Hollywood monopolies. But here he says, the question, did you encounter problems in releasing the film during the war period? We got the answer print of Native Land on December 8th, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. The Soviet Union had been attacked in June 1941. Now the U.S. was in the war. After years of government stalling in response to the aggression of Hitler in Japan, we were headed for a period of national unity. Native Land was finished as far as wide distribution was concerned, because the emphasis in it was not on class unity.
Well, that's true, and most unions did agree to give up the strike throughout World War II.
And Hurwitz says that the party refused to help them influence the trade unionists because the party was taking a line of national unity.
Well, that's unfortunate, and there wasn't much of an opportunity after World War II either, because it moved pretty quickly into the Cold War.
So all that work was for nothing other than the creation of quite a beautiful work of art
that we get to watch and listen to today.
And look back upon as a missed moment in every way.
Yet another one. It could have led to so many other things for Paul Robeson. Obviously one of the great narrators.
Right, and of course, what does he lend to this other than his beautiful voice? Well, his beautiful speaking voice as well as his beautiful singing voice. He, like Woody Guthrie, he lends his authority as a socialist entertainer and leader.
Yeah, a person of conviction.
And an American socialist entertainer and leader like Woody Guthrie. So Hurwitz also talks in the interview about how this independent film group came about, how it emerged from his early dissatisfaction with socialist filmmaking in his milieu at the time, which was just going out and filming the events and thinking that that was enough, without thinking that art had any role to play here, that art could even enhance the message, that it was even necessary in order to capture the truth of the events that they were trying to document, right? So he starts to get this idea of the film as an essay, the documentary film as an essay. He first forms a group called Nikino, and Frontier Films, the production company that made Native Land, grows out of that. He says, Paul Strand came from Mexico, where he had done The Wave. Willard Van Dyke came from the coast. Irving Lerner, Lionel Berman, Sidney Myers, Ralph Steiner, and Jay Lida had been associated in some way with the League. We had very little money. We met very frequently. We talked, studied, and experimented. Some of us observed group theater productions and took classes in acting and directing. We had in mind that this activity would be preparatory to the formation of a production company. Frontier Films was a natural outgrowth from Nikino. Lillian Hellman, John Howard Lawson, Paul Robeson, Archibald MacLeish, and others were on the advisory board, excited by the idea of a truly independent film in America. Joris Ivens was in the country at the time in 1935 and was a very important stimulus and source of encouragement. So this just gives you a picture. Just because Robeson stopped acting in films and renounced Hollywood doesn't mean, on the contrary, doesn't mean that he had given up on the idea of cinema as an important art form and as something that could be socially significant, or given up on it as something that he wanted to be involved in. On the contrary, he was still very much involved in filmmaking after his acting career in film ended. And he wanted, well, this is what he wanted to make. He wanted to make a truly independent, socialist, artful cinema.
Well, they did it.
And nobody saw it.
It's interesting that you say Joris Ivens was in America at the time, because he does use a few shots from native land in The Song of the Rivers.
That's what I thought.
The KKK stuff.
But also, the intros are very, very similar.
Well, they are, but specifically the KKK being used as a reactionary force. The exact same shots recur.
I didn't notice that.
So it must have been, well, I don't know, maybe used with the permission of native land, or...
Well, I assume so, because obviously these two were friends and mutual influences.
Yeah. The Song of the Rivers is coming from the other side of the world.
Well, yeah, and many years later, 1954.
We're in the thick of the Cold War at this point. It's not been all that cold, really, because the Korean War has been going on. And we see a lot of discussions of the destruction that they wrought in North Korea. This is an East German film. It claims to be speaking on behalf of most of the world.
It was commissioned by the World Federation of Trade Unions. It was not representing the world at this time. It was representing mainly the communist part of the world.
Right, but we certainly have plenty of aligned forces from non-communist countries. We've got, what was his name? Saillant. He speaks a lot in the film. He's a French labor organizer. We had an Italian labor organizer. We had all kinds of representatives of countries that were not part of the Soviet bloc.
Asian, African.
Right. I mean, there was actually a lot of emphasis upon revolutionary activity in Japan. It was notable because it was occurring under American occupation to some extent.
So Dave, this movie, unfortunately, Robeson, other than in spirit, is very glancingly involved in this movie. I did read in more than one source that Robeson recorded the song that he sings at the beginning of this movie in many different languages. We, however, only heard it in English.
The voice of the singer.
And this was after his passport was confiscated.
Yeah, so he couldn't collaborate in a close way with anyone working in East Germany.
And he was using, he had to create a recording studio at home with his son as the engineer.
Yeah, so he just recorded a little message to the podcast and zipped it over to East Germany. Things were a little more difficult back then, but at least they got that bit of collaboration in.
And I mean, I guess it is extremely significant in that this is mostly an anti-American movie, but it is not abandoning America altogether.
Well, no, not at all. And it is trying to recall America to its best self. It's telling Statue of Liberty to...
Oh, beautiful woman, you have looked out on the Atlantic for too long. Now take a look behind you.
This is certainly a product of a very dangerous moment in world history from the perspective of the makers of the film, but also possibly a moment of optimism where it could be believed that America could be beaten back. It's certainly making a very interesting case as well that has proven to be 100% correct, that you don't even have to be formally, politically a colony of a capitalist power in order to be captured by its exploitative scheme. The liberation movements that were happening throughout the world were not necessarily going to lead to anything all that great for the people in those countries if, let's say, France or Britain pulls out politically but leaves companies there to continue their nefarious work.
Of course, it's talking in a moment that feels very early, but of course maybe this was extremely common Marxist commentary from very early on, right? I don't know how early, but it's talking about the replacement of traditional colonialism with capitalist imperialism.
World hegemony under the heel of the stock market.
Okay, well, with your historical knowledge here, Dave, why don't you zero in on moments that you thought were, or ideas that you thought were particularly interesting or effective in this movie?
Well, it's a very schematic incantatory, again, poetic effort here. It is attempting to trace a common destiny for humanity. Basically, all world civilizations developed along the shores of rivers, and that's an important organizing motif for the film. It talks about all these different rivers. You think it's done with rivers, and then it comes back to another one. And there's a new song for each river that nevertheless bears a striking resemblance to the other songs of the rivers that have come before.
Music by Shostakovich, who apparently had a very ambivalent relationship with the Soviet Union.
That's understandable.
Quite understandable.
It's hard to not have an ambivalent relationship to the Soviet
Well, if
Union.
you lived there at the time, then it would be hard not to, yes. The more enthusiastic Marxists like Bertolt Brecht, appearing here to write the lyrics, were less ambivalent.
Well, I think ultimately all of them developed at least some ambivalence.
Probably not as much as Shostakovich, though.
No, maybe not. It was aiming to be a bridge from the old horrors to something brand new, and it never made it. The movie is certainly not claiming that the World Socialist Revolution is a fait accompli, or that any of the glorious things that socialism can achieve have actually been really brought to fruition yet. But it is gesturing towards that aim. It is making some statements that echo native land, right? But obviously it doesn't have any American Popular Front ambition. It doesn't need to reconcile the needs of the present with the traditions of the past in one particular political culture.
What is this film as essay? What is the thesis of this film as essay? Well,
it's making an anthropological argument. The telos of the human is to be the socialist worker, and maybe even transcend that to just be a being living in a socialist society.
If we're going to have this socialist transformation, all of the workers from all of the nations are going to have to come together. And on what basis are they going to come together? On the basis of all of our differences are transcended because we are workers and we understand what that means. We understand the toll that exploitation has taken on us. Like we see that sequence when they're all meeting at this convention. Miners from different countries, miners of different races are showing each other the marks on their skin.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's a whole bunch of sequences like that, showing each other the marks on their skin, but also showing other elements of common humanity that don't have to do with being workers, like, here's my son. Oh, of course, it's more like a story like, here's my son, he was beat up by the police because he was trying to organize labor, but still, here's my son, oh, here's mine. And everybody's smiling, cute!
Yeah. They're all dead, but great. It is depicting labor as a double-edged sword, right? The idea that, homo faber, right? This idea of the human being as a creature that makes tools and remakes its environment. That's the idea motivating all of these montages of human ingenuity. It's this idea that humans can make their own environment, and that's what socialism is supposed to be, right? We can remake our world, make it to suit ourselves, make it to suit everybody.
We can end poverty, we can end hunger, and we can ultimately end work.
Yeah, we're not going to fetishize work. That's the hope anyway, although I'm not sure if this movie gets... I do feel like it's a little stalled on the idea of work.
To show the man with no work.
Yeah.
Right? And what a pitiable thing that is. And immediately after that, they jump into the happy? Who is happy? Who is happy in this world run by the capitalists? This is not our world, and then they show the hell of work.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're doing all of this and you're remaking the environment for the benefit of a very few people, who run the stock market.
And in the meantime, you are being horrifyingly exploited.
Work is the most demonic thing ever conceived of.
And that is the world that we in fact live in.
Yeah.
Not the world where everyone is happy.
If you are working with your fellow human beings to remake the world for the benefit of all, well, it becomes a much more joyful thing, and there's a goal beyond the work, which is a paradise that's within our grasp, right? It certainly has its share of condescending attitudes expressed. One of the last sequences takes us to the Amazon, where it laments the fact that the people there don't know how to use machines.
Well, those communists They really do have a hard-on for the machine, don't they? They're almost like futurists.
It exposes them to some pretty nasty interludes like that. It's certainly not taking any measure of the real worth of the people there. If they are producing nothing in GDP terms, then they are inert.
The idea is get these people some tools.
Right.
Right? So their lives can be better.
It's certainly not saying, well, these people don't know how to do it. They're not occupied right now in anything that's going to benefit themselves or others. And that's the perspective of this Soviet bloc film. You can take that for what it's worth or leave it if you don't think it's worth much. I feel like it's a victim of its own rhetoric at points like that.
Right.
Certainly not going to inspire anyone from the Amazon who happens to see it.
What about the Happy Now Mr. Money?
Mr. Dollars.
Mr. Dollars.
Yeah, well, there's a whole montage that seems to come right out of season 3 of Twin Peaks with nuclear explosions all over the place. It's John Foster Dulles, right? Who's one of the architects of American foreign policy. Mr. Dulles, Mr. Dollars.
That's the pun?
That's a little joke that the film is having. Are you happy now, Mr. Dulles? Mr. Dollars? It was actually hilarious, that part. I mean, that felt like a Bertolt Brecht moment, although maybe he didn't write it.
You're right. The rhetoric of the film is very problematic at certain points and silly. I mean, the thoroughness of this application of the Marxist idea of the machine and what the machine means, yeah, it gets silly, it gets stupid. The narration is also very ironic and witty at times. It's not devoid of humor, is what I'm trying to say. It's not devoid of humor or irony, even though it maybe has insufficient irony at times.
Oh, it was a really interesting film to watch, and as we moved through it and realized Robeson was never coming back, that was certainly disappointing, but it didn't make me feel like we had wasted our time watching it. And it does express ideas and feelings that Robeson had in the 1950s. That's presumably why he associated himself with the film and was credited as the voice of the singer.
The American workers' greatest singer, something like that.
And who are we to argue with that? Seems spot on. I'm really sad we're gonna have to say goodbye to him now.
But we're not going to say goodbye to him until we've done our Robeson Top 10.
We've ranked the Robesons.
I'm going to let you go first, Dave, and don't get fancy, just 1 to 10 with a little bit of reasoning.
Alright, well, I did make it 10. I did leave Tales of Manhattan, Native Land, and Song of the Rivers out of my rankings because I didn't know where to put any of them.
Oh, I didn't.
Well, that's fine. People will get 2 takes. Tales of Manhattan is just such a small appearance. I didn't know how to stack it up against movies that he starred in and the films that he was involved in as narrator or singer only. I left those out too. We'll just call them wild cards. But here's my ranking, and I rank them not necessarily on what I think is objectively the greatest film, but what gave me the most of Robeson as an acteur.
Okay.
Number 1, Jericho. Number 2, The Proud Valley. Number 3, Big Fella. Number 4, Showboat. Number 5, Body and Soul. Number 6, King Solomon's Mines. Number 7, Borderline. Number 8, Sanders of the River. Number 9, Song of Freedom. Number 10, The Emperor Jones.
Okay.
Presumably you have something very different.
I do. I had completely different criteria. I actually, because there were so few movies, I actually did just go for a mixture that maybe only makes sense in my own head and is not in any way objectively quantifiable. A mixture of best movie, favorite movie, and what I thought Robeson's contribution was to it, and sometimes it wasn't contribution in terms of screen time or great role, but I felt that the movie reflected his personal values. But mainly my criteria were aesthetic. Alright, so number 1 was Showboat.
I do think Showboat's the best movie he was ever in. It's an incredible movie.
Yeah, it's very, very problematic in ways that we have talked about and has all of those limitations, even in the ways that it tries to subvert the American stereotypes. And we talked about those ways. We talked about how it even anticipates the ironic melodrama structuring of the white protagonist storyline and the black protagonist storyline, and the way that they diverge in the course of the movie, and the way that we are ostensibly following one but are really following the other. or at least some audience members would be, and how this anticipates Stahl's imitation of life. When was that made relative to Showboat? Was it before or after?
Stalls?
Yeah, Stalls.
34.
And Showboat is
36.
36? Right, so it doesn't entirely anticipate that on its own, because Stahl's imitation of life was already doing that, but it's doing it in the grander melodrama way that Cirque's imitation of life does. So it's kind of indefensible that I put it at number 1, because if you're using a different idea of what filmmaking is or can be, it doesn't necessarily deserve to be there. It's not obviously the greatest film out of the ones that we watched, but we are studio era Hollywood fans first and foremost, right? Aren't we? So that's always going to have an influence over our choices if we're faced with a really great example of that kind of filmmaking.
Yeah, James Whale made a great movie there.
Number 2, The Proud Valley.
Yeah, that was my number 2 as well.
A very unique socialist propaganda film that is very emotionally affecting and just unique in the vision it presents, that felt at least like it was the best representation of Robeson's own quirky form of socialism, right? And then number 3, Native Land. Aesthetically, absolutely fascinating movie. Completely recommend, completely worth watching for students of cinema and for the average cinephile. Number 4, Jericho. It was a movie that was just so much fun to watch and at the same time so politically subversive in ways that we do not understand based on the people involved in it other than Robeson. Number 5, King Solomon's Mines. Also a very fun watch. And although we didn't get into much research for this one, I tend to agree with you, Dave, on the face of it and the tiny little bit of research that we did do, that it is Verhoevening the shit out of its material. Number 6, Tales of Manhattan. I just really liked it. And yes, Robeson's role is very small, but the episode that he appears in, I don't think it's a jarring or disjointed ending. I think that conclusion brings the movie into exactly the direction that it has been heading in all along and kind of takes it into a new realm politically and aesthetically. Number 7, Big Fella, where Robeson first learns to do the sorts of things that he perfects in later movies, well, such as Jericho, that we talked about at the time, the subversion of tropes. Number 8, Body and Soul. It had to come that low because the role that Robeson plays in this movie has nothing to do with his later film persona or off-screen persona. But it's a great movie. Number 9, Sanders of the River. You managed to convince me, Dave, that it has a potential for subversion within the storyline of Robeson's character. And number 10, Song of Freedom. As horribly problematic as it is a turning point where Robeson starts getting meta about his career, up to date, and thinking about how he can change things and how he's going to take more of a conscious role in shaping his films from this point on, and to much greater effect in the films that he made after this. Until, of course, well, even in Tales of Manhattan, even to the extent that he managed to shape that sequence into a more overtly socialist direction.
With a big red tractor.
I think he managed to put more of a stamp on that film than he gave himself or it credit for. So I left out completely Borderline, because this movie just didn't hold any interest for me at all whatsoever, which really shows you, I think if you were someone who was more interested in queer cinema, I think it has a role to play in that history, for sure, and should be resurrected on that basis.
There's a lot of cool shots in that movie, too.
But in terms of what we were looking at in this series, which was not about queer cinema, it was about socialist politics and racial politics. It had no interest whatsoever. And so obviously Native Land was much more effective as avant-garde filmmaking that was about the politics that we were thinking about in this series, right? And The Emperor Jones, because whatever it was trying to do, unlike Song of Freedom, I can't even reconstruct what it was trying to do on a leftist basis.
It's a genuinely awful movie, awful experience.
And as we said at the time, probably even worse as a movie than it was as a stage play.
Yeah, it almost has to be, but I'm not so sure I would like the play either.
Doubtful.
Well, there you have it.
I thought we should just revisit the process of our thoughts in the course of this series, because I feel like there's just been so little scholarship devoted to Robeson's films for the reasons that we talked about in this episode and in other episodes. We had to do some real thinking on our feet and break some new ground here. And that is actually something else that Musser talked about in his article, which is when you're thinking about, with his 4 rules, when you're thinking about these films and their problematic representations and trying to reconstruct what they were trying to do historically, you have to think intertextually, and that means not only thinking about the relationship of the films to non-Robeson texts, but also thinking about the Robeson films together, because they do become, in the way that they're speaking to each other, in the way that you see him trying to evolve as an artist using cinema for his political ends, they become much more interesting than they are even individually.
Yeah. The big breakout, unexpected star for me was Jericho. Came completely unheralded. Nobody had much good to say about Jericho. I put it number 1, you put it number 4, so we both ranked it very highly.
I thought about putting it higher, too. I felt like I couldn't justify it, though.
It's so good.
Other than the fact that it was just so much fun to watch.
I don't feel like there are any missteps in that movie. It's perfect, almost.
Yeah, I don't know how well it works, really, as a representation of North African people.
Sure. You might give it some demerits on that score. Although, maybe, it almost felt documentaristic in The Great Salt Trek.
That's true. There just seems to be a slight amount of chauvinism in the way that Robeson just walks in and takes over.
Okay, well, it's vulnerable on that point. Last but not least, we got an email from a listener we haven't heard from before. So we always like to welcome people in by reading what they had to say about our efforts. This is from Andy in Montreal. Happy to have you as a listener, Andy. He says, big fan of your whole project, really amazed at your commitment to it. We just get so much fun out of doing this every week. I don't know where we'd be without it. And we're happy to have all of you listeners along for the ride.
And we get so excited when we discover, I hope we managed to convey that. I don't know what we get more excited about when we discover new interesting cinema that opens up new aesthetic and historical avenues for us, or if we just watch a Hollywood melodrama for the 99th time and get even more orgasmic about it on this viewing than we ever have before.
Yeah, it's a mix of those two, and a few less exalted experiences in between, like the cat creeps.
We always refer back to the poor cat creeps. It's really replaced, what was that, Nightlife of the Gods?
Oh, that was a bad one too, yeah.
As our memory of our worst podcasting experience.
The Bishop murder case. There were some bad ones back there, but even they have their place in our hearts. The title of the email is Lupino Sings. He says, I just wanted to note another Lupino singing role you might be interested in. The movie is interesting enough, but the performance is amazing. 1947, The Man I Love. Warner Brothers and Raoul Walsh. That's a movie that I have seen and I remember liking a lot. It's a long, long time ago. I had been wondering, there must be some other movie where Lupino sings. This clearly, she's playing a character who sings, and Elise did a little looking into it, and she thinks that it has been established that she may not have done the singing in that movie.
Well, Dave, you were actually playing this for me. And you know what? I think I looked it up at the time when we were recording Roadhouse, because I was trying to think if Lupino had sung in anything else. And yeah, I have seen this movie as well, but I don't remember it very well. It's been a while since I last saw it. And you were playing the song for me and going, that's her voice. That's definitely her voice. That is absolutely her. That's what Dave sounds like. That's absolutely her voice, Elise. That's definitely Lupino singing. I said, no, Dave, I don't think so, because I don't think Lupino can sing in any conventional way, and that person sounds way too good, although I agree that they've chosen a good fit for her speaking voice, much like Stanwyck in A Ball of Fire. Very good match for the speaking voice. It's uncanny. According to Google, Pegless Centra dubbed Lupino's singing voice for the film.
Oh, that sounds very specific. So it's not just, her voice was dubbed. It actually tells us who did the dubbing.
Yeah, IMDb confirms this.
There's always a possibility that it's wrong. After all, we watched Song of the Rivers because we thought that Paul Robeson narrated it.
Well, thanks, Wikipedia.
But anyway, this was not to undermine your comments, Andy, and we hope that you don't feel that way about it. Because, yeah, I was definitely on board with the idea that this was Lupino singing. Maybe it wasn't, but either way, we should watch The Man I Love again, and we should put it on the schedule. I was shocked to see that it's not, because...
Really?
It's one that, yeah, well, maybe, I guess the next plan we make for Warner Brothers 1947, let's put Man I Love on there.
We got some Lupino love on our Discord.
That's right, Simon commented specifically on a moment that we also exulted in our discussion of Roadhouse. The slap and the silly boy comment. Thanks a lot, Simon. Always great to hear from you in any context. Next week on the podcast, it will be our penultimate Hollywood Studios year by year episode for our first cycle, because we are on the second to last studio of 1948. It's RKO 1948. We'll be talking about Berlin Express, a Tourneur film, and a Losi film, The Boy with Green Hair. So you won't want to miss that.